Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a senior consultation specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics on the Northern Road Link project as it moves through the provincial environmental assessment and federal impact assessment processes. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. So let's get started. Today I'm flying solo. Jennifer's away today, and we're going to talk about the greenhouse gases and air quality studies that we're going to be undertaking, or that we are undertaking as part of the environmental and impact assessments. So let's get started now with just a review of what we're going to cover today. We're going to start off with, like we prefer to do, a bit of a project background just to get everybody up to the same level of information on the project. Then we're going to follow up with goals of the study, talk about sources of air contamination and or potential emissions, talk about valued components, as well as interaction of project activities with valued components. So with that, let's start with the background on the project. So this is a proposed all-season road in sitting in northern Ontario on Treaty 9 land. It would connect the Ring of Fire mineral deposits to the all-season highway network via, and then ultimately the provincial highway network via the proposed Martin Falls Community Access Road. And at the same time, the Northern Road Link project would provide an opportunity for Webequie First Nation to connect to the all-season highway network through its Webequie Supply Road, which would then connect with the Northern Road Link. This project is subject to the Environmental Assessment Act and the Impact Assessment Act, and it is pretty unique, I would say, in that the proponents are both Martin Falls First Nation and Webequie First Nation. Um, it's not often that First Nations are proponents on projects. We hope that occurs more and more in the future, but it's a pretty unique situation. And both of these communities are located about 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. Um, and they are remote communities, so therefore are not accessible by all season roads. There have been a number of studies in this area looking at the potential for roads or railway, but finally in 2020, the province of Ontario, Martin Falls First Nation, and Webequie First Nation agreed to work together and conduct a provincial environmental assessment, and then of course ultimately a federal impact assessment, and are moving forward together now on this initiative. And as I mentioned a little bit before, there are actually three all-season road projects going on right now. They all started at different times for different reasons. The most northerly one that you can see on your screen is the Webequie Supply Road, which runs from Webequie First Nation from the airport on Webequie First Nation, southeast to just east of the Mukattai River in the McFalds Lake area, which is essentially the heart of the Ring of Fire. And then from there, the Northern Road Link would run south on south to and then would connect with with the Martin Falls Community Access Road, which runs from Martin Falls, would connect to the Northern Road Link, and then down to the ultimately to the provincial highway network. So um, again, this would connect Webequie ultimately to the uh, provincial highway network. It would connect Martin Falls to the provincial highway network, and it would connect the Ring of Fire to the provincial highway network, so that um, materials can be brought to the mine, and then of course the ore can be removed from the mine and taken to market. So it facilitates the transport of goods, services, and resources. And in terms of the project components, um, so this would be an all-season road, as I mentioned. Right now, the plan is for it to be a gravel road. We don't know the exact final route yet, or the final preferred corridor yet. We're very close. So right now, it would range from anywhere from 117 kilometers to 164 kilometers in length, depending on which road segments make up the alternative road segments make up the final route. There would be, of course, a number of water crossings. The biggest one being that of the Attawapiskat River, which would be over 200 meters. The span would be over 200 meters, and then, of course, typical for projects of this nature, there is ancillary infrastructure, which means just sort of additional infrastructure that's both temporary and permanent, other than just the basic two-lane roadway. So these would include things like storage and laydown areas, which would be temporary for the storage and laydown of equipment and materials. And there would be maintenance facilities and yards. These would be permanent. I don't know how many there would be at this point, but there would be at least one. And there are access roads. There would be access roads to get to facilities such as the aggregate sites, um, the pits and quarries that are needed to provide the material to build the road with. And then there would be construction camps, and then these construction camps are typically associated, um, you know, are temporary, and the storage and laydown areas are typically attached to them or are very close to them as well, too, for obvious reasons. Um, in terms of, I think I was talking a little bit earlier before about we don't yet have a preferred corridor determined. Um, we almost do. And this map you see on the screen shows the various alternatives for different road segments. So once this is all finalized, you'll have one line connecting um, the northern end of the Northern Road Link, which goes to the Ring of Fire, to the southern end, which would link with the Martin Falls Community Access Road. So even though this map is a little maybe a bit confusing with all these different alternatives on it, ultimately we have to select, one of the different alternative segments, which are labeled by letters and numbers, and ultimately these get pieced together and form the final preferred corridor, which is like a planning corridor. It's a width of, believe it's 2 kilometers, and then yes, it's 2 kilometers, and within that 2 kilometers, the actual road would sit. So let's now move to today's topic, which is the greenhouse gas and air quality studies. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these studies, but I think I want to cover sort of the key highlights just so that people get a pretty good idea of it. There's a couple of goals to this work. The first is to determine the actual greenhouse emissions that the project is expected to produce, so come up with a projection for the emissions. And then the other main one is to determine the, the project's production of air contaminants, and the impact of those air contaminants on existing air quality in the project area. So like like all the other studies, we have to establish a baseline. And so, we use that baseline as a sort of a comparison point so we can predict potential impacts um, that we can hopefully mitigate or try to eliminate or reduce or minimize or even, so that's what we're trying to do when we do the baseline studies. So there are a number of different sources of air contamination, um, or potential emissions from projects like this, and most of them occur. I mean, the bulk of them occur during I would say during the construction phase. So it would be things like exhaust from construction equipment and road vehicles during construction. You're using heavy equipment, for building the road, for clearing the vegetation first to get that corridor open. And of course, typically those that heavy equipment burns diesel fuel, and there is exhaust from that. So there's that component. The aggregate extraction process. So you're talking about um, uh, extraction of gravel, and or quarry operations where you're processing a rock to and producing it in the right size, crushing it to the right size to use for construction purposes, for different purposes. That involves these crushing machinery. All this involves the use of requires burning fuel, and there is exhaust or emissions from that. Blasting activities creates from from the explosives can create quite a bit of dust during construction as well. That can have hopefully a temporary impact. And again, I mentioned diesel generators as a source of power, to for the construction camps and for the maintenance yards as well, too, burning diesel. So maybe eventually there will be a power line that runs through this corridor that will allow this to be done with much fewer emissions. But those are basically the sources of air contamination or emissions. In terms of what we call the valued components, valued components, again, just to remind everyone, those are identified as important things, and they're identified by the technical team. They could be identified by the community members, but they're identified as things that need to be looked at or studied because they're important. And so, in the case of this, we're looking. The two valued components are air quality and greenhouse gases. And I talked previously about water quality, where we took samples and then we analyzed those samples chemically by sending them off to the lab and running a series of tests to identify the levels of chemicals in those water samples, different chemicals. So we do the similar thing for air quality, but we're looking for different chemicals in many cases, like carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide and things like that. And then the contaminants that we choose are what you call indicators. So they're ways of measuring impacts, right? So if you want to understand the valued component air quality, an indicator um, would be changes in concentrations of certain air contaminants. And so you would take that air sample and have it tested and look at the concentrations of the different gases in that sample. So um, this is again about establishing that baseline, that basis for comparison, that basis for being able to predict potential effects of the project on the environment, on air quality and greenhouse gases. And then when we look at another valued component, greenhouse gases themselves, um, we would what we do is we what you call quantify the greenhouse gas emissions. Well, what I mean by quantify is to come up with an estimated number for amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we think would be produced from the project based on, for example, a certain number of vehicles, something like that. So, um, we get guidance from places like the Ontario Ministry of Transportation, Some of the greenhouse gases we would be looking at are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide as well. Um, and again, we're looking at this keeping in mind climate change. This particular area is becoming more and more important when it's studied on projects. So there's a lot associated with this work. Setting up baseline stations. We also look at information that has been collected previously, and I talked about this in previous presentations when I was talking about water, both groundwater and surface water, where we get results for air quality, for example, or water quality, and we see those results, and they may exceed whatever guidelines are provided by the province or the federal government, but you don't really know how to interpret that necessarily. And one of the ways to help do that is to look at previous work that's been done in the area. And fortunately, we do have some work that's been done previously. In our case, it's some of the work. I know it's some of the work for the Webquay supply road project. We have measurements that were taken for that project. So, and then we can also probably draw on any measurements that have been taken for the Martin Falls Community Access Road project and other previous work that might have been done as part of environmental assessments or other studies being done for mining type projects. So there's a lot of different sources of information, a lot of different ways to be able to sort of interpret the results that we collect, but that is basically what is involved in the greenhouse gas and air quality studies. Uh, they are they're relatively they're not particularly field intensive, these studies. A lot of the work is done sort of back on the desktop, provided there's enough field information available, but they are really important studies that feed into the overall environmental assessment and impact assessment. So that wraps up today's discussion of greenhouse gases and air quality studies. We hope this was helpful. We hope it also encourages you to join us again next week when we discuss the human health studies. Don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, northernroadlink.ca. Miigwech, and make sure to look out for project updates on social media and our website.